Well, what exactly is new about the model economy now? Net exports respond to interest rates, just like investment does. Why is this happening? It's because savers around the world, international savers of all types, Germans, Japanese, Chinese, Argentines, Americans, everybody responds to changes in real interest rates. And the reason is that they've got a bunch of cash they want to invest in a place that pays them the most returns. So they will go after the highest real interest rate. And what that means is that net exports end up being negatively related to the domestic real interest rate and positively related to the world real interest rate. That's because when the domestic real interest rate rises, savers buy up U.S. stocks and bonds, either government or corporate bonds, anything like that. In order to invest, they need U.S. dollars, and so that drives up the value of the dollar because the demand for dollars is higher. That raises the real price of U.S. exports, lowers the real price of U.S. imports, and lowers net exports to the United States. When the world real interest rate rises, the reverse happens. So you can think about a simple rule of thumb in this model being that whatever happens to them is the reverse of what happens to us. If the policy tool does something here, well, suppose it did the same thing abroad, well, then the reverse happens to us compared to what would have been the case if we were talking about the domestic tool. So this is an example of that. The first bullet point here says, well, suppose our real interest rate rises. It produces a reduction in our net exports. The reverse will happen if the foreign real interest rate rises. And the reason is people will shift their cash toward foreign investments, foreign saving investments. We need a different word for it, basically. What that means is that they will demand fewer dollars, they'll demand more foreign currency. That lowers the price of dollars, it results in a depreciation, and it raises our net exports. So what we're going to do is specify a new formula for net exports that looks a little like the formula for domestic investment. Rather than just be a particular share, it's going to consist of these two other pieces. The first piece is the domestic real interest rate, and that has a minus BNX thing in front of it, meaning that a rise in the domestic real interest rate lowers our net exports, other things equal, but there's a plus BNX sign in front of the foreign real interest rate piece on the right-hand side there. So that means that when the foreign real interest rate rises, the reverse happens, right? It's saying that net exports will actually rise if the foreign real interest rate rises because what it's doing is producing a depreciation. It's the reverse of what our real interest rate would be doing for us. Well, the IS curve will look like the following. Remember that this is how we start the IS curve. We're going to think about aggregate demand, the component-wise determinants of it. If we divide everything by Y bar, which is potential GDP or permanent income, we get this. And then what we will find is that the left-hand side, Y over Y bar, is also 1 plus Y tilde, because Y tilde is defined as Y minus Y bar over Y bar. So there's an extra little constant factor in there. And now the first line of this is all the pieces from consumption, investment, and government. A bar C is the usual level of consumption as a share of permanent income. The next two bits, A bar I and the B bar I times R minus R bar, that's the part that determines what's happening with investment. And there's an A bar G, an aggregate demand shock associated with government spending. And then this new component here. So originally this was just a constant A bar. Well, now it's got this extra stuff that's dependent on the domestic interest rate, because if that rises, that causes an appreciation of the dollar and a reduction in net exports. That's the first piece. And then there's a second piece that says that if the foreign real interest rate rises, the reverse happens, that's going to look like an aggregate demand stimulus, because their currency will appreciate, will have higher net exports as a result. The new IS curve actually looks exactly the same, but the A bar thing is determined a little bit differently. So it has this part in there that is a function of the foreign real interest rate. It's because if their real interest rate rises, we will see a depreciation. It's a good thing for us insofar as our net exports will rise. The slope term technically is also bigger. Now, the problem here is to think about what a bigger slope actually means in the graph of the IS curve. The responses are different. What this is telling us is that if the slope is bigger, you get more bang for your buck for a change in the real interest rate. The B bar thing is larger than it used to be without the net export effect. A rise in the world interest rate will increase A bar and shift the IS curve out just like anything else that shifts A bar. That's the insight in the first part of all this. Just like other demand shocks, any rise in the world interest rate away from normal must be temporary. It can't be permanent. It wouldn't make sense for it to be permanent. The tricky part is that the slope of the IS curve, this is the part about the B bar thing being two components now instead of one, the slope of it is actually now flatter in the space we're accustomed to looking at. And that's because net exports also respond to the real interest rate in addition to investment responding. The intuition here is that when the real interest rate here rises, investment declines because it's a worse deal to take out borrowed funds to produce capital investment. And so does NX decline because the real exchange rate, which is the real price of U.S. goods, has risen because with a higher real interest rate, savers around the world will see that and demand more dollars, bid our currency up, and that's actually bad for net exports in the short run. Mathematically, this B bar is bigger, so it's saying that at every level of the real interest rate, RT, short run output, Y tilde, is also bigger. And unfortunately, that means a flatter IS curve. I know it's not intuitive because of the way we have written down the math of the IS curve and the shape of the IS curve with the axes we've got. Well, so let's think about a rise in the foreign real interest rate in the ISMP Phillips curve PC model. Well, why would this happen? A foreign central bank might be fighting inflation by using its own short-run model. Well, what do you think will happen to short-run output and inflation abroad if this is what's happening? Well, if the foreign central bank is fighting inflation by raising real interest rates, foreign inflation should fall. And the way the central bank obtains that is by actually causing this recession. So short-run output abroad will also fall. Well, you can just kind of jump to the finish line as a nice rule of thumb. Remember, I told you that whatever happens to them typically is the reverse of what happens to us. This is true in the open economy framework with monetary policy. And so it turns out that the effects on short-run output and inflation tend to be exactly the reverse. Openness to investment and trade, so the flow of capital and the flow of goods results in a mirror image type of effect that left alone, what that does is stimulate our GDP through higher net exports, but it also is inflationary. Well, how does a rise then in the foreign interest rate affect the domestic economy and the I should say the ISMP diagram and in the PC or Phillips curve diagram up here at the top? And on the lower right-hand side, we've got inflation as a function of time. If the foreign central bank raises its real interest rate, what do savers all around the world do? Well, they see that higher real interest rate, and savers like higher interest rates. So they decide that they will demand more of those foreign financial assets. And in order to get those, they need to demand fewer dollars and more foreign currency. That lowers the nominal exchange rate and the dollar's real exchange rate. It results in a depreciation of the dollar. Well, what does that do to the U.S. net exports? It actually increases them because they are now cheaper. And so the IS curve shifts out and the economy booms. So now we are at this boom point, which is to the right of where we were. Through the Phillips curve, that is unfortunately inflationary. And down here on the right-hand side, we see inflation rising and then continuing on unless something else changes. Well, you might wonder, then what? Well, in fact, there will be a response, other things equal. The U.S. Federal Reserve, that's our central bank, will see this rise in inflation above its target pi 0, which is where it started. And the Fed will raise interest rates to combat domestic inflation. So the MP curve will shift upward because the Fed is combating inflation. And for example, if it wanted to just stop the increase in inflation, it might raise the MP curve up to this point, which would produce this new equilibrium back at 0. The Fed might do this because it knows that the shock of the foreign real interest rate rising is only temporary. If the increase is large enough, this will fully stop the rise in inflation. And then, of course, the issue is whether that's sufficient, whether the Fed's happy with that. It might raise the real interest rate even further than this R prime level if it needed to actually pull inflation back down again. But we might think, well, then what happens after this? Well, eventually the positive shock to aggregate demand must wear off. Net exports will return to normal, and maybe this is because the Fed has raised U.S. interest rates and caused an appreciation. But it's another way of viewing it is that the foreign central bank might have finished its fight on inflation over there, and so it lowers its real interest rate. That will shift the IS curve back, and that causes a recession temporarily because the interest rate here is high. So now we're going to find that this is the new point of intersection between the IS and MP curves. And what that will do is lower inflation through the Phillips curve. So we found ourselves at this recession, and that is disinflationary, I guess, rather than deflation. We haven't actually had negative inflation. That's what that actually means. Once that has happened, then the Fed can lower interest rates back to where they used to be, and that returns us back to normal in this short-run model. So the Fed can drop the MP curve, and we're back to where we started, back in the beginning of all of this, basically. Short-run output equal to 0. We're in neither a boom nor a bust at this point. That's the new intersection here at 0 and R bar. And through the Phillips curve now, inflation will just be stable back where we were. If we looked at the time path of output and inflation after this temporary aggregate demand shock from foreign monetary policy, this is what we would see. Before the foreign central bank raises its real interest rate, that's its monetary policy tool, inflation would be stable and output would also be growing at potential, meaning short-run output is 0 and stable. Well, if the foreign real interest rate rises because the central bank over there, say, is fighting inflation, demand drops for dollars as savings flow abroad. So foreign savers will see that happen. They will invest their cash in foreign-denominated assets, and they don't want dollars. They want that currency. U.S. exports actually increase and imports decrease because the dollar depreciates through this, and the IS curve shifts out. That raises output and inflation immediately. The Fed will raise the MP curve. Typically, this will be a gradual thing. The increase in inflation will halt ultimately, and short-run output will be lowered back to 0. So this is a diagram that's really more pertinent for the aggregate supply and aggregate demand framework, but you get the idea. It still is appropriate here in the ISMP thing. When the foreign real interest rate returns to normal, the IS curve will shift back, and that lowers output and inflation. Sorry, the IM, there's a bit of a typo. I'm not sure what that's there for. Inflation will fall, and the Fed lowers real interest rates, which raises output. So we've got a brief recession and then a return back to hunky-dory normal. So that's all I've got to say. You should have a look at the text. There are different effects when you're talking about changes in our domestic real interest rate. Namely, that's a movement along the IS curve and not a shift in the IS curve. Thanks very much, and I'll see you on Thursday for the review.